Good morning. My question is for Christopher Clark. Christopher, I'd like to hear your views on the whole issue of rebranding and the public image on the international stage, and reconcile that with the domestic media as it relates to you're trying to assist us in building this brand and the perception that the international community has on what we're doing. And one of the things that you just highlighted was the whole area of what is needed and what is really driving our economy. How do you counter the local or the domestic presence or the media relations that focus specifically on, one, a political perception, two, tearing down more so from the perspective of saying this is what has happened, more so than constructive journalism from the point of view that says this is why this has happened? I go back to the issue with the French blacklisting. And one of the things that I wanted to see from the media here is someone to take it up and understand why that was the case and why the BVI, or why it's important for the BVI to address the issues. More so, what you heard or what you read from the public domain was we were blacklisted and it's a bad thing for the BVI. Yes, we recognize that. But how do we move from the point of view to say this is how we should address, this is why we should address it, and more importantly, why we need to ensure that it's addressed from the perspective of ensuring that the BVI remains sustainable?
Wow, that's a question. Thank you. Listen, I can't really comment on the local media here in BVI, but from an international perspective, I'd offer two observations. One is that we all need to think what the international media commentators are going to care about. And they like writing bad stories. That's how they sell press. That's the starting point. Good news does not make good copy, as you all know. However, I think going back to a point I made earlier, by making what is, I don't not want to answer your question, I'll come back to it in a second, but by making what you do more relevant in an understandable way, I think is going to help enormously, because often it is the commentators at the front of the paper, at the front of the program, who are not financial services specialists necessarily as media, who make the bigger stories in consultation with financial services reporters. Secondly, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, this is not going to change overnight. And I can only think that by building up a reputation for a particular perspective and a credibility as part of the market from where you start, rather than perhaps in the past having a more neutral reputation, that could put you in a more advantageous position. I don't know whether that's answered your question at all, because it's really difficult to answer, because there's no easy win. But I think that you need to consider what matters to international commentators and journalists who are being fueled by NGOs, fueled by politicians, and fueled by reports which use the money saved or wasted by international offshore financial tax havens and relating it to what could have been spent in emerging or developing markets.
We all know that The Guardian is the mouthpiece of the NGOs and is certainly less than objective in its journalistic standards and the way it reports on offshore financial centers. Have you identified any newspapers or any press outlets that are in fact far more objective and that can be better relied upon?
I mean, the Guardian isn't necessarily it is not the newspaper that certainly capital markets and financial services would turn to tell a compelling and a strategic long-term value proposition of what financial services gives. So yes, there are many, many other titles, The Economist, The Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, that typically tell more of the strategic long-term financial story within financial services. However, you raise that The Guardian is a really interesting point here, because I'm not sure that it would ever be, and it has probably never been, on the BVI's priority list. It's probably on the watch list, not the priority list of media to engage with. the Premier's smiling. I assume that's because it hasn't been on the proactive list at all. But actually, if you turn it on its head and think about and assume that The Guardian will continue to be unhelpful, it is one of the most widely read international websites, and therefore carries great weight and credibility with NGOs and other international markets. And if you turn it on its head and again explain and build a relationship with The Guardian through original content about how financial services helps to fuel economies and livelihoods, then I think you start to have a very different relationship with the newspaper, and that you've never wanted to necessarily engage with in the past. So I think it's almost looking at it very differently and not shying away from it, but proactively engaging.
Richard, you wanted to add something to that, and then a couple of questions from Mr. Smith and His Excellency.
Just a very brief comment that I'm not sure how many of you are aware in the room that I think, if I've got this right, your technical head of state actually sits on the left of the Premier, John Duncan, Governor Duncan, who came here, I think, 5 months ago tomorrow. And John is the former head of communications at the FCO and has very good relations with the NGO community, worked closely with them at the FCO. He's a great resource. I don't know to what extent he wants to wade into this, but if anybody understands the NGO community and your critics, you have a real expert in your midst here. And I know you were going to just make a comment coincidentally. So
you're going to have Mrs. Smith and then His Excellency.
But I just wanted to respond to the point that I think Christopher and I think Richard made it too, about the importance of telling a good story about the BVI and how it fits into wealth creation in the rest of the world. And Russell would be familiar with the book, The Elephant and the Dragon, written by Miss Meredith. And the only thing that's lacking from that book is that she didn't talk about the role of the BVI in China and India, and that's the kind of person that we could use. It's a racy, interesting, factual story about wealth creation in that part of the world. She's now moved on to Goldman Sachs. I don't think she's going to want to go back to that, but if you could get somebody like her to do that, I know we have all the other people. But my question was really for Ron, or Richard, to answer Ron's point, because it's something that constantly exercises my mind. The possibility of a 10% tax, so that the BVI is seen less, or is no longer seen as a tax haven, quote unquote. Richard, how do you see that as a possibility, something that should be explored? And how do you see that impacting business in the BVI?
The one point I would make rather obvious, if your client group likes it, it would be quite helpful from the government's perspective. So let's start with that. Where's the downside? Ron usefully makes the point that it is, Ireland has a 10% tax rate, and that is a bit of an international benchmark. If you have a 10% tax rate, it's rather difficult to get attacked. So in a sense, one of the advantages you have with that is you mimic larger tax systems that, say, for example, are within the EU. It makes it very difficult for them to attack. The critical question is how the international community would respond to that if it was elective. In a sense, there's a degree of artificiality in that. Of course, if you imposed a 10% tax rate across the board, it would achieve the objective of making the rest of the world happy that you had some tax here. But then I'm afraid Simon Filmer and others would lose a lot of business here. So to my way of thinking, it has a lot of merit. It's very little downside from the governmental perspective. The question is whether the elective nature of it will be seen as contrived, and it certainly bears investigation. It's a great suggestion.
Okay, I think Ron's quickly, and then His Excellency.
Richard, of course, has to say that because we're partners, but there are different ways to approach it. I mean, in Canada, for example, there are basically two corporate tax systems. One is for what are called Canadian-controlled private corporations. They pay tax at roughly half the rate of what we refer to as public corporations. one way to approach it as opposed to just making it elective. And I'm not sure that elective doesn't work, but another way to approach it would be to say that if the shareholders are individuals resident in the BVI, the tax rate is 0. If the shareholders are outside of the BVI, and there is international, I mean, there's all sorts of international examples, and as I say, Canada is one of them, where that is done, it's not regarded as being discriminatory, and so there are different ways to approach it.
And that of course, is the, you know, what's not fashionable is ring fencing, where you give 0 tax for locals and 10% for, but if, 0 tax for foreigners and 0 for locals. But if you do it the other way around, where you tax foreigners, that doesn't offend ring fencing principles. And I would note, of course, which you would be aware of, Lorna, that Barbados effectively does this with their IBC. You can have a domestic company or an IBC. So as Ron usefully makes the point that there are a variety of ways you could, in effect, elect without looking quite as artificial on that.
I hesitate to take the floor because, of course, economic development is a delegated responsibility to the elected government of the BVI. But nonetheless, thank you all for a very stimulating presentation. As Richard said, I was the head of communications and spent the last year before coming here defending this very dossier, so I'm fairly well versed in it. I'm beginning to sound, I think, to some of you in the room a bit like Cato the Elder, which will be lost on the US-educated members of the room, perhaps. But there we go. What you have described is only partially financial services. And that concerns me, because we keep talking about rebranding financial services and the BVI's role in financial services, but as Richard described, we are not simply doing financial services, and we will make mistakes if we don't have a clear notion of what it is we are doing. Mm-hmm. We provide financial services, we provide also legal services, and that's very important that we keep in mind that it's legal services. Mm-hmm. Indeed, I think our recently engaged communications experts can help us come up with rebranding what it is, because it is not sufficient, in my view, to say financial services. It is something much wider than that. And I'll give you some specific examples. We have just are looking at creating an arbitration facility. That's a legal services. There's nothing to do with financial services. Mm-hmm. We have just extended the law so that we can now have a shipping register for much, much larger vessels. We immediately came in with requests from very large fishing ships. I'm not talking about little trawlers off the west coast of Scotland. I'm talking about those mega boats that go down to the Antarctic and they make millions. And they want to be registered here. But we haven't altered the law. So we need to do changes in our law that sits below the rich shipping register to make that happen. So if we're to seize these business opportunities, which is what we're talking about, let's be careful of our terminology and not just simply talk about financial services and its rebranding, because it's wider than that. And actually, we've got more opportunities that we can seize as BVI going forward. So it's a note of caution. As I say it rather often. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are many questions I believe that could be asked. I must say that sitting here listening to the panelists, I contemplated whether I should have a stiff scotch at lunchtime because the pessimism is just amazing. We talk a lot about more substance, value-added services, repositioning ourselves, and so on. And I believe there have been mention of perhaps one or two things. We talk about directorships and so on. But, and I think one of our panelists spoke to having a big issue from a marketing point of view, etc. But if we are to reposition ourselves, I mean, what realistically are 3 key things that we ought to do that will make a difference in terms of preparing ourselves for the future and sustaining the industry and ensuring the financial viability of the territory going forward? Can we identify 3 things of real substance that can make a key difference going forward?
Substance is clearly important. That's a major theme in the BEPS project. The notion of light touch, high volume companies could be a challenge for BVI going forward. So the Premier referred to the educational system, the importance, and it could be a long-term goal, but to educate the BVI population so they could staff corporations as directors and engage in professional services. Very useful. And in the meantime, I note, Broderick, you make the point that your immigration process is designed to permit foreign expertise to come in and infuse the environment. I mean, the reason why London and New York lead financial services in the world is because they are two of the most open labor markets for the interchange of professional expertise. I think you ought not to fear bringing foreign professional expertise in here to train and leverage domestic capacity. I know this is a long-term project. We all like quick wins, you know, quick fixes, but I think long-term, the Premier is very much on the right track with suggesting educating the local population to assume a bigger role in bringing substance to the activities here.
Christopher, what would you say? Ed?
I'm going to have to say again, authentic content. Authenticity, I think, is critical. And I've got two others, if that's...
Sure.
Speed of change, I think speed and increasing the ability to change more quickly. And one cultural answer, which is, and I think I'm sensing this from the Premier and everybody else who's spoken, is to think bigger and take a few risks in terms of not perhaps doing things that you haven't done before. And I think there's an appetite, a cultural appetite for that now.
Ron?
Keep it simple and keep it honest.
Yeah.
Okay. Broderick, you actually get one.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm actually surprised Jerry has asked a question. Only because, we've explored the big ideas. The tangible things are hard to come up with. We have to fix the fundamentals, and that's what the exercise is all about, fixing the fundamentals. So I would say I give you 10.
Good morning, everyone. My question is pretty basic. It has to do with the disconnect or the gap between MSMEs, micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, understanding financial services, and that there are opportunities there, and not to see everything as something that's weighing them down. It seems to be financial services on one end, and everything else floats on the other. When the dialogue starts, it's a dialogue that all persons in the financial arena, that's their thing. But I don't know, panels, maybe you can help me out. Many of our local MSMEs do not understand financial services, how it could impact them, and where opportunities lie for them in it. So in your line of work, in the things that you've seen in other countries, what are some things that were done to try to bridge that gap, to try to get them to understand? Because you need buy-in. If you're talking about the future of financial services, and you're talking about after we're gone, the longevity of it, you need your population, as you rightfully said, to understand. You need people to be educated. Not just those of us that probably work in government and get the opportunity to go to a session where we're exposed to what's going on in the financial service industry, but that layman on the street, that carpenter, persons that are trying to build a budding business, they need to understand that it's about all of us. So you need that buy-in. You need to make sure that your people understand, so that when decisions are being taken, people understand that it's for the greater good of the economic viability of your country.
Thanks in some ways you've answered your own question. I think I would suggest that one of the things that Broderick mentioned was the point of the population buy-in, and I think that's perhaps where the point you're raising needs to be addressed. And you're absolutely correct. It's one of the reasons we put everybody who in tourism through this, maybe the front end of this conference, because it's important that all of us understands how this economy is interconnected and intertwined. It's not, as the Premier correctly said, there's a very direct thread between tourism and financial services, and the more we understand how our economy functions, the greater appreciation we have. If financial services has trouble, money is not coming to the Treasury, petty contracts can't happen. People who have buildings rented to people around this room, those disappear. People who have apartments, food store, car rental agencies, the whole thing is connected, and we do have to have a greater appreciation for how the economy goes. I do want to end here before I get into further trouble. I'm already there. Thank our panel for a very good job. Well done, I must say.